my topic reads the extensive stage small cell carcinoma, a new lease of life. And the reason I have actually given this topic is because small cell is something that we kind of had ignored before, not really bothered about treating, but now thanks to new treatments, we really are looking at it in a much more interesting way. When we look at the topic today, I will talk on the treatment guidelines. I talk about the unmet need in SCLC. This is a session definitely a lot of talk to be on the IM, okay? But I will try to cover other recent developments in SCLC and see where we stand today. 15% we kind of to ignore it and so on and so forth. The majority of patients with small cell lung cancer are advanced disease. We typically follow the two classification from the disease group there. Go ahead, does this intensive state SCLC has been traditionally platinum-based chemotherapy with or without PCI later on. Now, in the past several decades, starting from very huge in the last 20 years, there was hardly any change. There were efforts made. Irinotecan was used, we used topotecan, we used the taxane. All of them came back in the second line and so on, but nothing much changed in the slide.
We can't hear you actually. Voice is missing a lot of times.
I think am I audible now?
But you have to repeat last 10-15 seconds. Yeah, now audible, but repeat last 10-15 seconds. Yeah.
So what I was saying was about the need for more efficacious treatment in SCLC, both in the world and in India. The 5-year survival has pretty dismal. It has not really improved over the past 10 years. The 5-year survival in India is around 5.9%. The 5-year is 2.4 and 2-year is 5.9%. So when we look at the overall requirement, now in the last 5 years, we have had certain new changes. And the biggest changes, of course, is related to the immunotherapy. In June of 2018 came the IM power 133, the atezolizumab with chemo, and in June of 2019 came the Caspian study. Both have really started the treatment of small cell lung cancer. Combining chemotherapy with immunotherapy has, combining the immuno and chemo does have potential to convert high response rate into survival. This is something that I have discussed several times as to how the combination works. It includes priming the cells, it includes priming our immune system, using PD-L1 blockade, trafficking of T cells, infiltration of T cells, and finally killing of the cancer cells by T cells. I'm not going to spend much time. Coming straight to the IM Power 133, which is the phase 3 pivotal trial of atezolizumab in first-line SCLC. Looking at certain important points. The staging used was the VASD staging that to classify the extensive stage small cell lung cancer. Patients were allowed to have brain metastasis. As many as 200 patients had it. The endpoints were co-primary endpoints of PFS and OS. When you looked at the protocol used, we used atezolizumab with carboplatin etoposide for 4 sites. Now, this is important because, as I will be showing, this was slightly different in the other studies. Why did this trial use these recommendations? There is a meta-analysis which showed that beyond 4 cycles compared to 6 cycles, there was really not much benefit when you do the extra 2 cycles. And therefore, this study used only 4 cycles. Obviously, with less chemotherapy, you have less toxicity. When you come regarding combination with carboplatin, again there is a meta-analysis which says that carboplatin and cisplatin have almost equivalent results, but less toxicity. Something we are comfortable with, and I think this is what NSCLC has also gone with. We use cisplatin, carboplatin pretty much interchangeably. So this is what the IM Power 133 used. Interesting, PCI was permitted. However, only 44 patients received PCI. In practice, I would say this is slightly lower. We do tend to give more of PCI, and that's kind of what we are used to. Consolidation radiotherapy, there has been a lot of active interest in this in the last 2 years since last year's ASCO paper, which showed that consolidation radiotherapy helps. But in this study, it's not permitted. But since it was not permitted in both arms, it wouldn't have been a difference. However, considering practice, if we add this consolidation radiotherapy, maybe we can improve survival less more. Looking at it was around 64. Interestingly, 50% of 5 years of age. Most 95% were either current smokers or ex-smokers. Only 5% net smokers. Now, the one interesting thing is they also looked at blood-based TMBs. We do keep talking about immunotherapy, TMB, and PDL1. So this study used blood-based where they used two cutoffs, more than 10 and more than 16. When you took the cutoff as more than 16, 23% of patients had more than 16. Whereas when you took the cutoff of more than 10, it is 59%. Again, a lot of debate goes on about TMB. I'm not going to the details of it, but it's interesting that this trial tried to establish TMB and that too on the blood, not on a biopsy. When we talk of brain metastasis, like I said, there were 8.5% patients with brain metastasis at enrollment, 38% with liver metastasis. Dr. Sachin, I hope I'm audible clearly now. There's no problem in my...
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Thank you. Right, so to continue. And coming to the co-primary endpoints of overall survival. When the combination of atezolizumab was compared to the combination of only chemotherapy, the median overall survival was 12.3 months versus 10.3 months. Now, again, 2 months itself may not sound much, but in the context of small cell lung cancer, this is the first time that we are seeing overall survivals of more than 1 year. Hazard ratios of 0.7, confidence intervals, a little slayed but still acceptable. Now, this is at a median follow-up of close to 14 months, which is pretty okay. Looking at the 12-month overall survival, 51% here, and then we of course have the updated analysis. Now, in this updated analysis, 1.5 year survival of 34%, which means 1 out of 3 patients is still going to be alive and doing well on the same protocol at 18 months. For small cell lung cancer, this is pretty remarkable. Looking at the median follow-up here, close to 2 years. So definitely one of the criticisms of immunotherapy is the shorter follow-up. For small cell lung cancer, 23 months is pretty adequate. Looking at PFS, well, like a lot of studies, PFS is not become used to with our immunotherapy. 6 years and p-values very much. Look at unity on month. Again, not very good. We would have liked better, but something that we have been used to. Interestingly, this PFS advantage is still maintained with time. The difference is maintained, so that at 12 months you still have a 12.6% present, which is again in the context of SCLC not bad. Looking at the overall response rate, when we looked at the median duration of response, it was 4.2 months to 3.9 with the atezo versus the chemo. The patients with ongoing response were 15% compared to the only 5% in the chemotherapy. Looking at the subgroup analysis. Now, if you look at the analysis, almost all of them tend to favor atezolizumab. The only difference being successes, which kind of goes the other way, but then look at the numbers. 368 and 35, I think that's pretty much negligible. Really cannot comment on anything or make any conclusions with small numbers. More interestingly, something like becomes more interesting as we look at it. Looking at the cutoff of 10, not a huge difference. Both the groups did better. Interestingly, the TMB more than 10, even the chemotherapy is now approaching 1 year, whereas the atezolizumab is around 15 months. So, interesting, though not significant. When you look at the TMB cutoff of 16, here it is going up to 17 months. The confidence interval is just close to unity, but this is giving some indicator that probably, maybe, there is a cutoff. Again, so the number of patients is only 80 here, but this is something interesting because it potentially gives us a biomarker. However, looking at the TL1, now again, this analysis is a post-hoc analysis when you start looking at TMB and PDL1, and as we have seen it across tumors, these are not really mutually inclusive. So just because you have PDL1 high does not mean high. Looking at a cutoff of 10, when you look at a cutoff of 10, only 30%, number 30% only will either have a PDL1 high or a TMB more than 10. When we look at the expression wise, again, looking at the number of percentage of PDL1 on IC, this is not the routine score, this is not a normal score of tumor cells, this is a score of immune cells. More than first is and then they looked at the responses based on the PDL1. Here, unfortunately, there is no predictive value observed for PDL1 expression. Looking at the intent to treat, yes, there is difference, but when you start looking at the PDL1 expression, in fact, the less than 1% seems to do slightly better, kind of really acceptable clinically. When you look at 8.9%, less than 5%, more than 5%, again, no difference. Looking at the numbers, it was great. 29 people had, patients had more than 5% in the 21-month median OS, but then looking at the overall responses, I am not going to really talk much about this. I will look into it, and that's what the trial has concluded, that there is no predictive value observed for PDL1 expression. Same thing when we look at the PFS, more or less advantages maintained over all subgroups, with the exception of our own brain metastasis, which is what we kind of expect. Looking at the subsequent treatment, now around 55% of patients underwent subsequent therapy in the atezo group, around 61 underwent placebo group. So 50 to 60%, and the third treatment only in 20, which kind of that this is a disease which is rapidly, and once it progresses, there's not much. We already know.
Actually, we are losing your voice again. We lost your voice. Previous slide.
Okay. Previous slide. All right. So what I was talking about was the subsequent treatments. When you look at the
No. I can't hear you.
What we can you hear me now?
No, yes, but last few seconds again, you were totally lost. Yeah. Again, not able to hear. Not yet. I think can others hear, or is the problem only my audio?
It's not audible.
Not audible. I am not audible. Vamsi was actually giving a very excellent lecture. Where is he now?
Hi, I've joined him.
Oh, great, sir. Where is Vamsi? Has he lost his connection totally?
Sir, Dr. Vamshi has lost his connection. I think he logged out.
I think he's trying to log in again.
Audible?
Yes.
Audible now?
Yes.
Hello?
Unmute yourself.
Hello?
Vamshi, unmute yourself. Vamshi, can you hear us? You unmute yourself, please.
Yes, Dr. Sachin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I am unmuted.
Yeah.
Huh? Is this better?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. The internet is something that is playing up here. So I was talking about this slide. Is this the slide where I missed Dr. Sachin or the previous one?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please. Vamshi, start your talk now. Hello. I think there's something massive problem with his internet connection.
Sachin, I think
Yes,
we
sir.
have the next speaker, and maybe
Yeah, maybe we can give him a few minutes later on. Yeah, I think so, sir. And so we have. We will start with the next session, which is on breast cancer now. And so my first speaker here would be Dr. Devinder Kaur, who is a medical oncologist at in Ludhiana, and is a dear friend and a very good speaker. And he would be delivering his talk on optimal management of ER-positive metastatic breast cancer and focusing on CDK4/6 inhibitors. Devinder, you can go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Hi, Dr. Sachin. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me for this webinar. It's good to see all the colleagues and seniors and teachers also. So my job today is to give a slide presentation regarding the optimal treatment of HER positive metastatic breast cancer. So I'll just first of all upload the screen. Just give me 1 second. Actually, I'm getting a problem getting uploading the file.
Doctor, you need some help from the organizing side. They can put up your slides. Neerav can help you.
Yeah, if they can do
Have you
it.
sent?
Sir has not sent the slide to us also, so we are waiting for the slides to send.
Yeah, actually, I just sent it just around 5 minutes back. You can.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Vamshi, meanwhile, can you summarize this thing? Are you there now? Vamshi, can you hear us? Is your connection better? Till the time Devinder is loading his slides, you
Can
can.
you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. It's not there yet. Devinder, are you?
I am really sorry. Would be regarding cancer median OS of around 12.3 months versus 10.3 months for the placebo. It is a well-tolerated regimen. Now, as someone has also put up the question regarding Caspian. Now, Caspian was a study which had certain differences. The major differences, they allowed both cisplatin as well as carboplatin. and they allowed up to 6 cycles of chemotherapy. The results there are somewhat similar. You had around 12.5 months median overall survival and a median overall survival in the placebo group around 10 months. Now, interestingly, both of these are PD-L1 inhibitors. Now, the reason this is because we have a nivolumab study, which is a PD-1 inhibitor, and we also have another study of pembrolizumab, the Keynote 604. Both of these studies are unfortunately negative. Again, if you go with the actual numbers, they're somewhat similar to the PD-L1 inhibitors, but then when you start looking at the p-values and the trial design, these studies have been negative. So if I have to conclude today as a treatment of first shot, it would be definitely an immunotherapy chemotherapy combination. Whether you want to use durvalumab or atezolizumab is kind of up to comfort. Personally, I prefer atezolizumab because I've used it in a couple of patients. It has worked well, and it's price-wise, it is more easy to use. It is slightly cheaper, and it's more of a comfort value, I would say, rather than ethics. Both the drugs seem to work well, and definitely you have to try and put some IO combination with the chemotherapy. That would be my most important take-home message.
Great. Thank you, Vamshi. Thank you for summarizing it. And Devendra, are you ready now? Can we start?
So first of all, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Devendra Paul. I am medical oncologist at DNL Medical College at American College Institute, Ludhiana. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Sachin. So I'll be discussing about the optimal management of ER positive metastatic breast cancer. Till date, we have been treating because luminal type A metastatic breast cancer, as we all know, it's not a very uniform disease. We have a spectrum of disease depending on the clinical burden. Some diseases are very aggressive, and most of the patients have a low burden of disease, but around 10 to 15% they do have a disease which goes into visceral crisis very quickly. So the treatment has to be optimized. Till date, we have been treating the patients depending on the patient heterogeneity and the disease heterogeneity. The patient heterogeneity depends on the age, the menopausal status, the preference of the patient, the genetics, and the pharmacogenomics, and the disease heterogeneity means that patient whether he has a visceral or non-visceral metastasis. But the trend which we are seeing over the last 5 to 7 years is the emergence of tumor biological heterogeneity. So tumor biological heterogeneity is the thing in which we see the various mutations which are happening in the patient's tumor. More specifically, ESR1 mutations, PIK3 mutations, AKT, and the activation of HER2 pathway. And of course, there are certain other resistance mechanisms which are also there. So the biological heterogeneity of luminal tumors, the principal characteristic of the luminal group is the luminal expression signature. In the luminal A subtype, the most frequent mutation is the PIK3CA, which is seen in 45%, followed by the other rare uncommon mutations. And then the luminal B, we have the T53 followed by the PIK3A. And in addition to the P53 mutations, several other events may also intervene in the other steps, and they also lead to the downstream activation of various other pathways. In patients who progress on the AI treatment, the most common mutation happening is the ESR1 mutation. And as you can see, there are multiple predictive markers for the endocrine therapy, but till date, the only marker which has a level of evidence is the hormone receptor status. And this, as such, there is no biomarker which can help to decide between whether to give tamoxifen or the aromatase inhibitors, and also there is no biomarker to decide for or against the use of fulvestrant. Again, the same slide showing the biological heterogeneity, and now we know there are multiple pathways which can be activated, and now we have certain drugs which we can target them. For example, the CDK4/6 inhibitors and the PIK3 inhibitor which are coming into picture. And there are many other mutations which are and applications and molecular pathways which are under trials and which are under studies, which we in the later years we will see whether we can target them. So at present there is no validated predictive biomarkers other than the hormone status and which have decided the treatment, and the CD4, CD6 inhibitors or the mTOR inhibitors which have come into recent picture. So they are the recent advancement, but till date we have only the hormone receptor status is the one thing in which in such patient which is predictive of response. Empacillin should only be used in the patients with PIK3 mutant tumors. Next slide, please. So the visceral crisis is defined as the severe organ dysfunction as per the signs and symptoms and the laboratory studies and the rapid progression of disease. Visceral crisis is not a mere presence of visceral metastasis, but it implies the important organ compromise leading to clinical indication for the most rapidly efficacious treatment. Next slide. So there are many trials in the ER-positive advanced breast cancer which are brought into the premenopausal treatment. But despite this, we all recommend that a young woman with the ER-positive advanced breast cancer should have adequate ovarian suppression or ablation, and then she can be treated in the same way as the postmenopausal women with endocrine agents, with or without targeted therapies. The adequate ovarian suppression for advanced breast cancer premenopausal patients can be obtained through bilateral ovarectomy, continuous use of LHRH agonist, or by ovarian function ablation through pelvic radiotherapy. Although this modality is nowadays not used more frequently. So the efficacy of ovarian suppression must be initially confirmed analytically through serial evaluation of serum estradiol, even in the presence of amenorrhea, especially if an aromatase inhibitor is being contemplated to be administered. So the question which is the most important question right now in such a scenario is when to use CDK4/6 inhibitors and whether endocrine therapy versus chemotherapy for advanced cancer has a place, and how to integrate the new molecules which are there like the PIK3 inhibitors, and also there is some evidence for the use of mTOR inhibitors also. So the question is, should CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors should be used first line or second line? There is no debate for patients who relapse on FDA therapy. These patients should be considered for fulvestrant plus CDK4/6 inhibitors. However, patients relapsing off endocrine therapy or who present with advanced disease, there is evidence that we can use single-agent aromatase inhibitors followed by fulvestrant and CDK4 inhibitors, or we can use upfront AI with a CDK4/CDK6 inhibitor. So these are three pivotal trials for the CDK4/CDK6 inhibitors, which we all know. The Paloma-2 study with the palbociclib, with the Monalisa-2 study with the ribociclib, and the Monarch study with the abemaciclib. And as you can see in all these trials, they have a very good efficacy data, and all have shown a very good PFS benefit and OS benefit now maturing, and all have frankly, they have changed the paradigm of treatment of advanced metastatic cancer ER positive. Next slide. So, depending on all this data, how can we identify who does well on AI alone, who is a candidate who will not be doing much better on the hormonal treatment? So, the patients who have endocrine naive disease, who have low volume or non-visceral disease, and who have a lower grade and less X biology, they have more benefit of AI with CDK4 and CDK inhibitors, especially there the hazard ratio is quite good. Whereas the patients who are less likely to do well are those patients who have relapsed recently on AI, or those patients who have a high grade disease, or those who are in a visceral crisis. Like we all know, those who are in a visceral crisis, they are not so likely to respond to hormonal treatment only. This is the cross-track comparison of fulvestrant plus the CDK studies, including the Monarch 3, Monarch 2, Paloma 3. In all, we can showing the matured PFS and the OS benefit, OS data, and in all, you can see the hazard ratio is quite significant, and now the curves are quite separating, and the data is quite, I can say, quite bold and quite mature now. And there is no, but although we don't have any direct comparison between all these three drugs, but yes, of course, the data as far as their single use is concerned is quite promising. So, a first-line treatment for advanced hormone-positive breast cancer, if the patient is AI sensitive, that is endocrine naive disease, or more than 12 months post adjuvant AI treatment or prior tamoxifen treatment, the preferred treatment is aromatase inhibitors plus a CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors. And if the patient is premenopausal, we have to give ovarian suppression along with that. But if those patients who are AI resistant, that is those patients who relapse on aromatase or on aromatase hormonal treatment, less than 12 months of stopping, that is within 12 months of stopping the AA, we have disease progression. In those, we have the recommendation is to use fulvestrant plus CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors, and in a premenopausal lady, of course, is there. But anytime if there is an organ failure like visceral crisis, till now, chemotherapy is the thing which we use all day, always. But we have some data maturing now that even in those cases also there is something, some data to show that there is efficacy of CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors also. This is just a slide to show that even post CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors resistance mechanism there. You can see the slide from there. There are multiple pathways which can be activated in a patient who progress on CDK4, CDK6 inhibitors like the NF kappa B, PIK3, AKT, and Wnt beta catenin pathway. So these are things which are under evaluation, and coming few years, we might have more targeted targets to be achieved over here. In the end, just a few slides regarding the integration of a few more molecules which come into picture, the everolimus and the alpelisib. Regarding the everolimus, the pivotal trial, the Bolero 2 trial showed that in a patient's everolimus plus exemestane post 2 lines of hormone resistance, there was quite a good amount of PFS benefit of 6.9 months as compared to 2.8 months with a placebo versus exemestane. And on the right side, you can see that the rationale of using the mTOR inhibitors is that when the disease progresses, one of the main pathways for activation is the PIK3 followed by the AKT. So AKT is a site with the mTOR inhibitors can react, and they can inhibit the downstream signaling pathways leading to survival benefit. There were studies regarding the use of concomitant use of everolimus with exemestane, tamoxifen, or bulvestrol also. But the license indication is still with the use of is the combination of everolimus with exemestane only, because in that setting the data was not that convincing. So everolimus is used along with exemestane only. And regarding the new drug on the block, the alpelisib, there was a trial, SOLAR trial, which showed that in the patients who had the PIK3CA mutations, the combination of alpelisib with fulvestrant was significantly better as compared to placebo. You can see that the median progression survival benefit was almost to the tune of 6 months. And this is the important thing to say. Remember is that regarding the PIK3CA mutation is that the PIK3CA mutation can be tested even on the baseline blocks. Also, we don't need to have a fresh biopsy to check the PIK3CA mutation, because the PIK3CA mutations, they remain stable throughout the course of the natural history of the disease. And similarly, in the patient who didn't have the PIK3CA mutation, there was no benefit whatsoever as compared to placebo. So alpelisib plus fulvestrant is now recommended, and alpelisib is just launching in India also. And so alpelisib plus fulvestrant is a new option to be used for the patient who have PIK3 mutations. So in conclusion, the current non-randomized evidence suggests that endocrine therapy plus CDK4, CDK6 inhibitor should be used first line in advanced cancer, and fulvestrant as the endocrine therapy of CDK4 6 inhibitors when patients have relapsed on AI, or otherwise AI as endocrine therapy. Everolimus has evidence for multiple endocrine therapies, but we should consider for the ESR mutation for this. And alpelisib only data with fulvestrant and has not been investigated post everolimus. In the PIK3 mutant, optimal sequence of alpelisib versus everolimus is unknown. That is, in the PIK3 mutant, we don't know whether giving everolimus prior to alpelisib has any advantage or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Devinder.
I hope I was audible.
Yeah, you were audible. Yeah.
Thank you.
And you raised some very, pertinent questions, which I think our next speaker, Dr. Jyoti Vajpayee. She is a professor of medical oncology at Tata Memorial Hospital, and she is also very much interested in breast cancer and leading the programs there. And she would throw light on many questions you have raised. And so let's hear what she has to tell us.
So thank you, Sachin, and entire team for this opportunity. And Devendra was a dear student and he was with us. So after him, it was a pleasure to speak. So Neerav, could you share my slides? I sent you in time.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Right. So in So, in the next few minutes, we shall be talking about the optimal management of ER-positive hormone refractory advanced breast cancer, picking the right strategy for treatment of 3CA, hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative advanced breast cancer patients. So, it is heartening to see that in our lifetime we have seen armamentarium is really widened in ER-positive disease. Otherwise, few years back it was only HER2 positive disease which is showing a progress. But now, every now and then we are seeing something or other which is adding. So that's really good. Next, please. So PIK3CA is the most commonly mutated gene in hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative advanced breast cancer. Around 40% of the patients with this population, which is hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative, have a PIK3CA mutation, which is really significant, almost half. So patients with PIK3CA mutation face a worse prognosis. Next, please. So the slide is showing that PIK3CA mutations are a common indicator of poor prognosis. In a study wherein the genomic analysis of 649 metastatic breast cancer patients was carried out, the patients with ER-positive disease who have relapsed or progressed during endocrine therapy or less than 12 months after the end of the endocrine therapy in adjuvant context, and also in meta-analysis of 1929 cases of patients with breast cancer who has received prior adjuvant chemotherapy, endocrine or combination. So presence of PIK3 mutation was a negative prognostic factor associated with poor response to therapy and a worse overall prognostic marker in breast cancer. PIK3, that's fine. So how to know your patient's PIK3 mutation status, which is really helpful in developing upfront treatment strategies. So PIK3 mutation have been associated with endocrine therapy resistance and disease progression and poor prognosis. These mutations can lead to cell proliferation, tumorigenesis, indicator of poor prognosis as well as resistance. So knowing your patient's PIK3CA mutational status may inform upfront treatment strategies and response to treatment. Next, please. So alpelisib, it is specifically address the PIK3CA mutations, and this is the new kid on the block, and these tablets are a potent and selective inhibitor of PIK3CA. These mutations may lead to activation of PI3K alpha, key upstream component of the PI3K pathway, and alpelisib inhibits the alpha isoform of PI3K 50 times more potently than other PI3K isoforms. That is beta, gamma, and delta. So it is alpha isoform, predominant inhibition. Alpelisib and fulvestrant work synergistically to inhibit both the PI3K and ER pathway respectively. And targeting PIK3CA mutations may overcome resistance to endocrine-based therapies used in hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer. Next, please. So about the SOLAR work, which is the first phase 3 trial leading to an approval specifically for advanced breast cancer patients with a PIK3CA mutation. So this was a kind of new signal, and in this randomized double-blind placebo-controlled multi-center phase 3 trial, which is in hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative population, advanced breast cancers, a total of around 572 patients were enrolled, including 341 patients with a PIK3CA mutation. And this trial was designed for cohort with a PIK3CA mutation, and inclusion criteria were essentially post-menopausal women and men as well, who are adult and having hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative disease, advanced disease, and recurrence or progression of breast cancer during or after AI therapy. ECOG performance status good, and PIK3CA mutation identified. So they were randomized to alpelisib versus placebo along with fulvestrant in both the arms, and primary endpoint here was PFS. PFS with a PIK3CA mutation, there is investigative assessment, while secondary endpoints included OS as well and response rates as well, clinical benefit rate and safety issues, including quality of life. Next, please. So in SOLAR-1, 52% of patients with a PIK3CA mutation received alpelisib along with fulvestrant as their first-line treatment, while around 47% received it as their second-line treatment in this setting. So, almost equal, around half. So this is the schema that after neoadjuvant therapy, endocrine therapy, if less than 1 year relapse, first-line endocrine resistant patients, then they would start with this regimen or as it is more than 1 year and relapse and endocrine therapy for advanced disease, they have already received, including CDK4/6 combination, and then they progress, then also they received the similar kind of treatment. Next, please. So this is the results, and alpelisib plus fulvestrant nearly doubled the median PFS in patients with alpha PIK3CA mutation, which is a very promising signal. So this curves are wide apart and right from the beginning, and you can see that median PFS is around 11 months in comparison to 5.7 months, and that is around 2 times PFS benefit for alpelisib and fulvestrant. So this is the category 1 preferred option in NCCN clinical practice guidelines, and for breast cancer. Next, please. So we can see here that these plots that the benefit was all across all subgroups, whether it is a visceral disease, bone-only disease, prior CDK4/6 treatment has happened or not, prior chemotherapy has received or not, in line of advanced anti-cancer treatments, independent status, secondary resistance, primary resistance, and so all across the benefit has been shown. Notably, even the patient who have been exposed to prior CDK4/6 has also shown equal benefit. Next, please. So there are a doubling of the response rates. So in comparison to placebo, which is 16%, 35.7%, and the overall response in all patients with PIK3CA mutation, the upper one was in the measurable disease, while in the lower one was in all patients, around 27% rather, in comparison to 13%. So doubling here as well. Next, please. So there are responses which are deeper as well with alpelisib. This picture is showing the same. Next, please. So what about the dosing and administration? So recommended dose of alpelisib is 300 milligrams. That is 2 150 milligram film-coated tablets, which can be taken orally once daily with food, and it should be swallowed whole and taken with food at approximately the same time each day. The recommended dose of fulvestrant along with this is 500 milligram, which is administered intramuscularly on days 1, 15, and 29, which is the usual schedule, and afterwards once monthly. The full prescribing information we can refer as needed. So certain areas may require dose modifications. So starting dose may be 300 milligram once daily, and the first dose reduction would be 250 milligram once daily if required. So that will be 1 200 milligram tablet and 150 milligram tablet. The second dose reduction, 200 milligram once daily, that could be just 1 200 milligram tablet. So dose interruptions may also be required prior to dose reductions. So dose interruptions is a better strategy, and if it doesn't work, then we go for dose reductions. And the alpelisib dose may be reduced in increments of 50 milligrams. If further dose reduction below 200 milligrams is required, the alpelisib is discontinued, and only one dose reduction is permitted for pancreatitis. So the tablet should be continued until disease progression or unacceptable toxicity, which is the standard norm, and it is given along with fulvestrant. Next, please. So about the safety issues. So we know that pan-PIK3CA inhibitors had a lot of toxicity. Fortunately, with the specific isoform which are inhibiting the alpha isoforms, it is better than those. And still the significant side effects are in the form of gastrointestinal, that is diarrhea, nausea, stomatitis, and vomiting. General disorder like fatigue and weight reduction, metabolic like hyperglycemia and decreased appetite, and skin rash. So these are can you go back to previous slide? Right. So I want to emphasize that the grade 3-4 complications are definitely, especially diarrhea, hyperglycemia, and rash. These are the three most important complications which we should remember, and we should learn to tame these side effects. As we would recall that when we started using everolimus, stomatitis was a major issue, and gradually we really learned how to tame it. So in our own TMH data, we found that when we analyzed our data, stomatitis was not rather that major problem, rather it was hyperglycemia, because many of our patients are having mass diabetes, and when we give them everolimus, they become frankly diabetic, and those kind of problems we found more. So we have to learn to really manage how the complication. Next, please. So the dose modification management of hyperglycemia, I think this is very important because the large majority of our population is either diabetic or it is mass diabetic, borderline diabetics. So if fasting sugars are more than 160 milligram per deciliter, then the dose adjustment is not really required. There is a mild elevation, and if it is the old hypoglycemic agent can be used like metformin, and we have to titrate according to the sugar levels. If it is 160 to 250 milligram per deciliter, then if fasting blood sugar does not resolve to less than grade 1 within 21 days after anti-diabetic treatment, then we have to reduce one dose level and we have to start oral anti-diabetic treatment. And if fasting sugars keep rising beyond the MTD of metformin, add an insulin sensitizer like pioglitazone. So if fasting sugars are more than 250 to 500 range, then we have to omit alpelisib, and then if FPG resolve to less than grade 1 within 3 to 5 days, while off alpelisib and metformin, then we can restart alpelisib and reduce by one dose level. However, if FPG does not resolve to less than grade 1 within 21 days after this treatment, we need to permanently discontinue. So that is very important. We have to be very vigilant about these sugar levels, and endocrinologists should have a regular sugar check and rigorous monitoring. So if FPG more than 500, omit alpelisib, and in 24 hours, if grade improves, then follow specific grade recommendations. If FPG is confirmed still at grade 4 in the absence of confounding factor, permanent discontinuation is needed. So we have to be really vigilant about these things. And of course, I would suggest that endocrinologists should be on board for all such management issues. Next, please. So lifestyle and dietary modifications to manage hyperglycemia, those are the standard modifications. We need to counsel them for lifestyle changes as per the American Diabetes Association guidelines. And exercise, weight management, low carbohydrate, high fiber diet, balancing carbohydrate and proteins, limited intake of trans and saturated fats, and the different meals. There are various diets which are suggested for diabetes management. So that all needs to be followed under supervision of endocrinologist and dietitian. Next, please. The only laboratory monitoring is needed for patients with alpelisib for fasting blood sugar and HbA1c, and monitoring should be done prior to and during treatment with alpelisib, and we must optimize blood glucose prior to initiating treatment. In the SOLAR-1 trial, patients with controlled diabetes and pre-diabetes were included if they had fasting sugars which is less than or equal to 140 and an HbA1c of less than 6.4%. So these both criteria has to be made. It has to be met. So one must be vigilant for these things. And during treatment with alpelisib in first 2 weeks, fasting blood sugar be done more than 1 time per week. And after first 2 weeks, at least once every 4 weeks, and as indicated, HbA1c should be done prior as well as every 3 months and as clinically indicated. In a patient experiencing hyperglycemia, we must consider consultation with a healthcare provider with expertise in the treatment of hyperglycemia and counsel patients on lifestyle changes as well as medications. And if a patient experiences hyperglycemia, monitoring of blood glucose and fasting sugars is as clinically indicated as well as more than 2 times per week until blood glucose or fasting decreases to normal levels. In first 8 weeks, more than 1 time per week, and after that, every 2 weeks and as clinically indicated. So this is also, I think, this is the most important complication which has to be, people have to be vigilant and monitor carefully. Next, please. About the rash, so prophylactic management of rash may decrease incidence as well as the severity of rash based on the SOLAR-1 trial. So the Dr. Hugo has shown this that in sub-analysis occurrence of rash in patients taking alpelisib tablets for fulvestrant who receive prophylactic treatment, which is in the form of antihistaminics, etc., can reduce the rash. So patients who are receiving prophylactic treatment prior to onset of rash, there's no rash experience in 73%, while patients who are not receiving only in 36% was not experienced grade 1 or 2 rash in 15% with prophylaxis, while grade 3 to 4 in 12%. While patients who are not on prophylaxis, grade 3-4 rash 23%, almost double than with what was happening with prophylaxis, while grade 1 or 2 rash in 41%, almost nearing half. So I think that using prophylactic measures, including antihistaminics, at initiation or during the alpelisib is really important, and it's a small measure which can make things better. Next. About the mutation testing, which is a critical component of hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative advanced breast cancer management. So why we should test? These patients with a PIK3CA mutation face a worse prognosis, and they are eligible for biomarker-driven therapy with alpelisib. So there is a target which is known for a bad prognosis, and this is a tameable target. Now this is a drug available. So that's why we should pursue this test. When to test? Test for PIK3CA mutations when a patient presents with metastasis of breast cancer, and so at the baseline only you can do this test. And some may argue that we are using some different options like CDK4/6 inhibitors or other endocrine therapy options. Then why we should test at that juncture? We may test later also, but because mutations are generally stable, so they don't really change. So upfront testing makes sense. We will be knowing that what is their status, and we are having a plan which is ready either in the first line setting or the second line setting. Both indications happen both. So PIK3CA mutations can occur in multiple coding regions, most commonly exon 9 and 20. And in fact, 80% of PIK3CA mutations occur in 3 regions, that is E542, E545 in exon 9, and H1047 in exon 20. How should this be done? So it's a Quasar 3 screen, that is a PIK3CA RGQ kit, next generation sequencing, which samples of tissue and liquid, both, so that both can be tested. And it is FDA approved 3 screen RGQ kit, which is now available in India. Next, please. So this combination, that is alpelisib plus fulvestrant, is a category 1, that is preferred option and in clinical practice guidelines for breast cancer. And one of assess for PIK3CA mutation as part of initial metastatic breast cancer workup. If all of the following are true, then the patient has a recurrent or stage 4 disease, tumor is hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative, and considering therapy with alpelisib. So in tumor tissue biopsy, if it is positive for PIK3CA, or if it is a liquid biopsy using circulating tumor DNA and peripheral blood, if it is positive both, there is an indication for using alpelisib along with fulvestrant. Next, please. So to summarize, PIK3CA mutations are present in 40% of hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative advanced breast cancer patients, and indicative of a poor prognosis. Alpelisib tablets specifically targets PIK3CA mutations, and they nearly doubled the progression-free survival in patients with PIK3CA mutation. The median PFS was 11 months for alpelisib plus fulvestrant in comparison to 5.7 months for a placebo plus fulvestrant. Based on investigator-reported results, and more than double the response rate as well. So who had the measurable disease, we have seen that the responses were around 36%, while 16% in placebo. About adverse events, we have seen about the side effects, how to manage them. So there are side effects which are more in comparison to placebo, but they are manageable and reversible. So alpelisib is a biomarker-driven therapy with NCCN category 1 evidence for hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative advanced breast cancer patients with PIK3CA mutation. and this has really widened our armamentarium. So at present we have options that because the results have shown that even if we reserve it for second line after CDK4/6 inhibitor, then also they have equal benefit. So what Devendra was discussing, although there is an approval for both, but we may use this as a strategy that we may use it as a second line option because results suggest good results in both the settings. Next, please. I think this is the last slide of mine. So thank you very much. And I'm happy that my thing was not interrupted and Sachin need to tell me that you're not audible.
No, you were very audible and very clear. And thank you, Dr. Jyoti.
All right.
And
Small question.
I'll request you to stay for the panel also, Devendra, you also, and Dr. Jyoti, you also, because the next panel is on ER positive hormone refractory breast cancer issues. Dr. Sahu would be taking up that. But just one question, Dr. Jyoti, would you now for your next hormone ER positive patient, metastatic breast upfront, now would you order this test upfront once you get ER positive and start using this?
I would prefer to use the test if there are no other inhibition.
Okay, and you would start using the drug upfront, or would you like to use this in second line as of now?
So that's what I said in my discussion as well, that although there is an benefit which is seen in both the settings, but because in the second line setting also it is equally benefiting. So I would perhaps want to reserve it as a second line because in first line we may use other resources. Post that also this therapy is benefiting, and the reverse sequence data is not with us. So I would prefer to use it in the second line, although the indication is there.
And just one last question: cost of the LP is it known yet?
I think it is around few lakhs, but
No, it's still a comment. I'm Dr. Chandra here. It is fixed around 70,000 rupees per month.
okay, so that is comparable to.
Yeah, right.
So please stay for the panel, Dr. Jyoti.
Sachin, I am having another commitment. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So it was a little we are in a little delayed, so I'm really sorry for that.
Yeah, we are right on time otherwise. And if it's possible for you, it's fine. And over to you, Dr. Sahu.
Yeah.
You start your settings, yeah.
Thank you, Sachin, and Jyoti, it was nice listening to you.
Thank you, Sahu.
Yeah,
We are meeting only on virtual space. Sorry, I will not be able to.
Sure.
Okay, Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful having you here.
Sure. Same here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. My slides are visible and I'm audible, Sachin. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's have in the next 25 minutes, let's see what we can make out of this panel. And I would like to invite the panelists, Dr. Gautam, Dr. Kunal, Dr. Sajan, Dr. Chandra, and Dr. Jatin. And that's what it should be, and Amit is not there. Okay, so straight to the case, because I would like to finish on time, and let's see how interactive it can be. The other panelists can unmute themselves when they come in, and I think I can request other panelists to just mute themselves so that the others are audible. So we have a 60-year-old female diagnosed as a cancer of breast 2013, and we have the breast conservation surgery done. We have a T2N1, and that was one node positive. We have a strong ER/PR positive. We have a HER2/neu, which is negative, and the patient received adjuvant chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and took AI for 5 years. At this point in time, very quick, 1 minute, Dr. Chandra, do you give AIs for 5 years, or in some cases you do give beyond 5 years?
A node positive extended AI, we are giving extended AI after doing a bone health and all that. So bone health is good enough, and I'll extend over next 2 years. That's what we have data.
So this you will do it for next 2 years.
Yeah,
That's what you standard for any node positive.
Any node positive.
Dr. Jatin, you are there?
Yeah.
You will be doing the same thing, or you do at 5 years?
No, I'm giving extended adjuvant.
Okay. So I would just now like to take it off because the topic is different. But yes, if you look at the standard of care, it is 5 years still. The beyond extension, there are few trials, but as of date, if you give 5 years, it should be enough if it's the aromatase inhibitor. For high risk, yes, few people have tried it, but we'll stop here because that's what the evidence is all about. So let's come to that. Hormone therapy was stopped after 5 years, presented at 13 months of stopping AI with severe backache, and PET scan showed a bony disease with multiple liver mets. Do we biopsy every disease after it comes back, Dr. Sachin? Do we biopsy every metastatic breast cancer?
Yes, sir. We biopsy wherever it is possible. Sometimes it becomes not possible. Only bone disease. Sometimes it is there and difficult. But then anywhere when it is possible, I'll do.
Okay, so I think that's the standard for all of us now, and all of us change our practice. That's fair. Anyone who does not want to biopsy? No, I'll take it that all of us agree. So the liver biopsy confirmed it again to be ERPR positive, HER2 negative, and the liver functions was a slightly elevated bilirubin, SGOT 2 to 2.5 times upper limit of normal, SGPT around 2 times of upper limit of normal. That's fine. The PET images is look, the liver mets are there and the bony mets are there. So what I wanted to put across, and I think Dr. Kunal can come in. Do you look at this and how do you define endocrine resistance in secondary? Dr. Kunal?
Yeah, so I think if we go by the current guidelines, it is more than 1 year of the prior stopping. Some do say more than 2 years, but I think as a consensus more than 1 year. And while if the patient is on therapy and within 6 months if they progress, then it is considered as primary, and rest all are considered as secondary endocrine.
Okay. Dr. Gautam, do you want to come in? Do you want to differ or you concur with him?
So I am fine with it. It depends on the whether you are considering the time period of 2 years or 1 year. So any definition can be sorted out.
Anyone wants to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the adjuvant setting, this patient who had Dr. Chandra here. So in the adjuvant setting, somebody who is, somebody who is progressed post adjuvant treatment, more than 12 months is considered sensitive. It's very less than 12 months is the resistance. So in a metastatic setting, during adjuvant, if a patient has progressed within 6 months, it's a primary resistance. More than 6, yeah. So, but somebody says within 6 months, that's what the primary resistance is. So,
2 years that you
2 years for adjuvant. Metastatic is 6.
Can I come in? This is Dr. Vivek.
Vivek, tell me.
So I think what I am clear about is that if the adjuvant is going on and you have progressed, till you have progressed up to 1 year of you have completed your adjuvant 1 year before. So till that time it is secondary, and up to 2 years if you have completed your adjuvant and during that time you come, then it is primary. And if it is beyond 1 year of your completed adjuvant, then it is not resistant at all. For adjuvant?
Yeah, for adjuvant, the definition as per the guidelines would be what most of us agree is that if the primary and secondary, the primary is defined as relapse while on the first 2 years of adjuvant therapy.
Exactly.
Or progression of disease within first 6 months of the first line for metastatic breast cancer. And this secondary will be beyond 2 years if someone is adjuvant, has progressed on adjuvant, but beyond 2 years it could be a secondary resistance. So I think that was a little, but most of the panelists do agree with this. So we'll move on, but this is very, very important, I think, to our protocol in choosing the right CDK inhibitors. The visceral crisis, do anyone in the panel feel that this patient was in visceral crisis? Anyone?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Who feels so? Who feels so? Can you just come forward? I'm not able to see all of you.
Yes, because the organ dysfunction has already started, so I will take.
Surgeon, it's you.
No, I'm not here. So from my side, I would say it's not a visceral crisis. Because by visceral crisis, we mean that there should be severe organ dysfunction. Severe organ dysfunction.
Jatin, for you it's a visceral crisis?
Yeah, I mean, if you go by the guidelines, it is not a visceral crisis, but practically I am considering this as a visceral crisis.
Okay, so your choice of therapy will be Jatin. I start with you then. For a patient, for you who's practically in vessel crisis, it will be what?
It will be chemotherapy first.
Okay, so for you, any patient who's having a liver mets and has a bilirubin that's starting to rise, you will consider liver met. You will consider chemotherapy. That's what. That's a fair idea. Dr. Gautam.
Yes, sir, I agree with Dr. Jatin. So a patient who has already developed liver dysfunction and SGOTP about 3 times. So I will consider it as a visceral crisis and go with the chemotherapy.
Sajjan, I know you are not considering this as a visceral crisis. Your choice of therapy. Directly.
So my choice will be to go for a CDK4/6 inhibitor along with the.
Okay. So Kunal, visceral crisis, yes, no?
No, I'll also go with hormonal therapy.
Okay. And Dr. Chandra, quick. Hello? Chandra is not audible. So we'll carry on. The panel is divided. Or let me now pitch in and tell me what I feel as a moderator. I have the privilege of that. I feel I go with my colleagues Sajjan and Kunal. I would not consider this a visceral crisis. And I will come to the slides why I would not consider. This patient does have time to be given a therapy which will have response. What I would consider visceral crisis is something that is fast progressing, that would not give you a second chance. And that is when I think chemotherapy comes in. And just the starting of a dysfunction with the liver metastasis up to 5 times, even clinical trials allow you to take this patient. So I think in a liver mets up to 5 times upper limit normal could be fair. But it is not only about the quantum of lab, it's a mixture of the clinical picture, quantum of lab reports, and the rapidity of progression. That's what I would consider as a visceral crisis.
Shah, can I make a comment here?
Sir, yes, sir.
The most important thing over visceral crisis for liver is concerned should be the presence of pain.
Okay.
Because that indicates a capsular involvement or stretching, and that is a marker for pain. We will see it in the ABC5 guidelines, which are just coming in the next month. We just finished writing it.
So, sir, you are in. So, what do you consider this patient? In crisis or not in crisis?
Not in crisis.
Okay. So, we'll move on. We respect the others. Can I come in? There's a lot of disturbance. This patient, again, the same thing, comes with the bony only mets. So, now we have 2 patients, one with the liver mets and bony mets, one with only bony mets. Will anyone think of a different approach? Dr. Jatin?
Yeah, I mean, if only bony mets are there, then fulvestrant alone, hormonal therapy will be the first choice. And
which one?
Fulvestrant alone can be used in this case.
What is your case against CDK4/6? You have a patient who's affording everything. What is
if the patient is affording, then I would give CDK4/6 inhibitor along with fulvestrant.
For the panel, we consider everyone is affording. Then the restriction goes.
One of the trials of the afferent CDK4 inhibitors, the subgroup analysis did not show a benefit in the bone-only disease. Another trial showed a benefit in the bone-only disease. So even if we are giving a single agent, means a hormonal therapy only, maybe letrozole or fulvestrant, I think in bone-only disease we can go without CDK4 inhibitors also.
Okay. See, nothing is absolutely right or wrong. What we are speaking of, if I can pitch in, yes, we have options, and if you give a single agent hormonal therapy, it's fair enough. If someone wants to combine, it's fair enough. But the best results come with the CDK4/6 along with the aromatase inhibitors or fulvestrant, either way. But the most important thing to tell, and there's a recent publication in Lancet Oncology that's published in February, that clearly tells us that across the spectrum, it does show that the benefit of CDK4/6 does come across the spectrum. If you look at the forest plots, let's also look at the p-value significance, and if the p-value significance has to be seen, we just cannot look at the forest plot and just pick out a chart out of it. So for all practical purpose, it is active across the segments. So let's come to what people were talking about. This is what all of us will discuss. I just want to go across and tell what few of the colleagues have told. Just look at this and look at this marker of around 25 months. And this is what I think people are speaking in the Falcon trial. The bony mets alone, fulvestrant is showing 22.3 months. So some people have a point. In those affordable, not affordable, we can go for fulvestrant. Sajjan, what's your viewpoint on this one?
Sir, I agree with this because this also is a very important data, and this can be one of the important alternatives to the choice which we have otherwise. So I think anybody who chooses this choice in bone-only disease could also be doing good for the patient. That's what I feel. Can be a good alternative.
Okay, let's come to this and I'll give the opinion of Kunal. Now, combination of fulvestrant and anastrozole, and look at the survival OS is around 50 months. So now, with this data, with fulvestrant Falcon data, with the CDK data, what is your choice?
So, in terms of first line, I would still be preferring CDK with AI, and reserve fulvestrant with another agent or as a single line for second line.
Jatin, what is your opinion on these three trials? Now, what is your choice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, usually what we do is with the advent of this new agent, now the pattern of my thinking would be that we should reserve fulvestrant for later lines of treatment.
So you will use CDK4/6 upfront?
I would use CDK4/6 upfront, yes.
Dr. Chandra, any thoughts?
I'll use CDK4/6 upfront. So I think we have enough evidence, and probably a meta-analysis showing that yes, CDK4/6 combination has resulted in survival advantage. Also, I think I would go and use CDK4/6.
Gautam, any different thoughts?
In bone only, I am still using the only hormonal therapy.
Okay, fair enough.
Then any other site of disease also, then I am combining it with the CDK4 inhibitors.
Okay, so you are still not convinced about the data, but this is something to tell you for Gautam probably from tomorrow. Fulvestrant versus the forest plot against anything that is a cyclin. And if you look at Palbo, Ribo, Abema, both favor, the combination is favorable to fulvestrant alone. That's across the tract. To be fair to you, you have this option in the NCCN that any one of the above is okay. But we have to give the best option to the patient. So, that is what Gautam was talking about. Should we be using and salvaging, keeping the CDK4/6 inhibitor for the later use? Any one of your practice, Kunal, how many patients do you really use first line? How many use second line? Out of 10 cases.
So it ultimately boils down to the affordability of
all are affordable.
All are affordable. I would probably want to give to all, only barring if there is a very probably a low volume disease, somebody who's frail, elderly. I would probably use only an AI. But otherwise, I would want to give.
Chandra.
So I think within the era of CDK4/6 and PI3K inhibition, and we have moved beyond a single agent endocrine therapy. So we have to use a parallel pathways to extend the survival. So I definitely go with CDK4/6 and PI3K. I probably next.
That's fine. We'll speak.
Yeah. So I think I'll go with CDK4/6.
Okay. For Gautam, you save it for a rainy day.
No, sir, only in the bone disease.
Yeah, only in the bone disease.
All patients.
Only in the bone disease. I take it. But to be fair to you, I want to bring in something. Look at the hazards of a front line and second line. The hazards is actually the same. If we look at it, the quantum of benefit is no different for first line and second line. And if you look at absolute values, the difference in absolute value across trials is 6 months. So it is not unfair. Let's not protect ourselves. It is up to a patient. But if you look at the hazards, the second line is 0.5, the first line is around 0.56. The hazards is matching each other. But look at the absolute benefit. Yes, because second line does not have that prolonged difference. That's why the 6 month difference is there from a first line CDK4/6 versus the second line. So this is for something I think all of us could go and do it patient wise. There's nothing to go front wise, but yes, I go with the panel that I also would like to give it as a first line choice rather than the second line if given a choice. Just to give you more data to give you that the benefit is same. This has been taken from the Mona Lisa 2. And look at the first line ribociclib plus fulvestrant versus the second line ribo plus fulvestrant. The hazards is actually the same. It's just matching each other. Any thoughts? Anyone? Sajjan, any thoughts about first line, second line now?
So I think, sir, I would agree with you that you showed the data also that we could use it salvage in the second line also. But I'm still keen to use in the first line. That's what I feel. And yeah.
Fair enough. Anyone in the panel wants to put a point forward before?
I think it's number of patients who go in from first line to second line. That's more important. So when you used CDK4/6 upfront, how many of them have crossed this median survival? Versus somebody who have used AIs, how many of them have used? So that is going to be a clear picture. In that regard, I think CDK4/6 will score.
I think in that, if you look at the trials, around 3/4 of the patients in both arms go on to receive the certificate drugs. So that in the lung is different, and in the breast will be quite different. So
I think,
please.
Can I come?
Please.
When these trials for CDK4/6 inhibitors came in the first line, there was always a subset of patient who had a low volume, low risk, indolent kind of a disease, bone alone disease, and was fair enough to use a single agent hormone therapy at that moment of time, and can add on CDK4/6 inhibitor later. It hardly matters in those cases.
Yes, I want to show now, especially to two of my panelists, and let's convince them, Gautam and Jatin. Visceral disease, is it good enough, and does it take time to act? This is the data which has come from the ABEMA trial, and look at the Monarch trial, and this is what it is. The red line shows the decrease in the disease with the combination versus the grey line shows the decrease with the AI. And this is going with this data. Again, the red line is showing the sharpness. What I wanted to point out is the CDK4/6 plus the hormonal agents do have a sharp effect from cycle 1 to 2 onwards. You see that responses coming, and probably takes 3 weeks, but it starts coming from the end of the first cycle to the start of the second cycle compared to AI.
This is Ahu specifically for abemaciclib.
I don't think it is for across the CDK4/6. Dr. GS, if you are online, can you give the comment on that?
I can give a comment right now, Shahu, but I will save it for the end. I preempted that this is going to come up, So I have something that I will show you all on this.
So we see very rapid responses actually with the upfront use of CDK4/6 inhibitors.
See, Sachin, the organizing committee head, has voted for this, and I agree, and we will just have and stop it here. So all of us agree that CDK4/6 is active. But Jatin, to be fair to you, it is across the CDK4/6. And there is data across the studies for cycle 2 onwards, you do get these responses. I would like to listen to Dr. GS. He has a more critical opinion about a lot of things.
Shall I come in, Soma?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so it is as early as 2 weeks. The response starts as early as 2 weeks. Yeah. But with the liver dysfunction, I'm a little skeptical using ribociclib. They might die of acute liver failure. So they I will not use ribociclib in that. Abema, we have experience, it's a difficult drug to handle. Palbo is a bit safe. So Abema, we are part of the trial, so we know the drug. So it's very difficult drug to handle amongst the 3 CDKs.
So this is how you choose a CDK. But on a class basis, you do see rapid responses. Yeah. So any concern
was present in only 50%. Can you go to the back slides, one slide back?
Yeah, it will be. Nothing will be 100%. You go to the immunotherapy, any drug, that will be not 90% or 80%. In chemotherapy, what would be your responses, Gautam? Can I ask you? No. Because we have to compare with chemotherapy. What is the response? It will be 20 to 30%, maybe 40. That's what it is. Okay. So any concern about
Dr. Sahu, you have 3 minutes left. Maybe you ask, if you have in your armamentarium, if you have any more critical question to ask.
Okay. I think I had 7 minutes left. The last day saw. That's okay. I'll take it. So I just wanted to point one more critical thing about this. I don't know how many of you have marked into. If you look at the OS data, at the 2 years, both the arm are same. It is beyond 2 years the separation starts. And this is where you should be looking at the longer OS data. I'll be more looking at the long data for at least the upfront one. That's very important. I'll skip that to tell you that for the endocrine sensitivity pattern, there is a lot of differentiating data between the abemaciclib and the Palbo. In Palbo, it showed that if you are endocrine resistant, it does not work. But for Abema, it works across the endocrine resistance. And for lack of time, I won't discuss this. I know Dr. GS will go into the final things. Age is not a concern. I want to come into how do I choose, and then I'll spend 1 minute on this. How to choose among the drugs? Can anyone come in? Because all the drugs are active, equally active. Anyone? Kunal, please.
Yeah, it's mainly about the availability cost. So, Palbo and Ribo, we have more experience. I have not used abemaciclib so far. And it is more easy to probably dose titrate in ribociclib. That is one thing I consider advantageous when you have to titrate from 600 to 400, because otherwise you have to get the new tablet. So that I think cost-wise there is nothing to choose.
So basically what I look at is Palbo has the most we have most experienced Palbo, the Indian doctors. Ribociclib is the second most. QTC is a concern, but it happens is around 2 to 4% of cases. Have a quick look on that. LFT is a concern, as Dr. GS and the panelists pointed out. We have to look into that. LFT has to be seen very carefully for Ribo. Abema, there is a lot of diarrhea that has to be a concern. Otherwise, what we know is Abema is a continuous dosing and monotherapy it is approved. A premenopausal ribociclib has the best data. So this is where I will stop. And last question, abemaciclib on CNS. Anyone concerned that I will be using abemaciclib on CNS? Gautam, your thoughts on this?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone?
I think it's the only CDK which has a CNS activity. But in a ERPR positive HER2 negative disease to find a brain mets is very, very rare. So it's like, so even somebody who has it, so definitely abema scores over there.
Okay, there's actually one trial which showed the abemaciclib data of intracranial benefit of 25%. Then across, beyond that, the Monarch, everyone had restricted brain mets. Yeah. So the activity is on a base, very limited data, but one abemaciclib data is there, the earlier data of 25% response. So is metastatic breast cancer chemotherapy out? It looks that we will have to fail multiple lines before chemotherapy comes in, or we need a visceral crisis, or we need doctors who are still convinced, who would be giving chemotherapy for all visceral lines. So that is what my take will be. But apart from that, a beautiful study. I would like Dr. GS to comment on this. This is from US. They have shown the Ribo plus letrozole to be much more cost effective than Palbo plus letrozole. Probably because the cost is lesser in US. That's the last thing. How do we manage the progression? This will be definitely what some of us spoke. The option is the last slide of mine. That CDK, we can continue, change the CDK, or we can endocrine, but we have the SPIC3 inhibitors, we have the mTORs, and that will be a thing to look at. We are also looking at the extended spectrum of the Monarch HER, where we are looking at a chemo-free targeted therapy combo with abema, trastuzumab, and fulvestrant. But to conclude, I'm sorry, I'm finishing on time, so I don't want to go for any more questions. There are interesting times to be a medical oncologist. We are spoiled with too much choices. See the difference of opinion in 5 panelists. That's what it is. CDK4/6 with hormone therapy are the best option, preferably in the first line. That's what my take will be. Premenopausal, the data is best with ribociclib. The Palbo data was not great in the subgroup analysis. In the unaffordable cases, was people told low bulk, bone only, the hormone combination of fulvestrant may be offered. That's what I also felt of the data. Post-progression, the PIK3CA inhibitors, there's beautiful data on capivasertib. Please look at the publication which came this month. The AKT inhibitor, that's also coming in the hormone positive spectrum, and the mTORs are also there. We have to look, and there are many more which are coming in. So this segment is also getting much more broader as the lung cancer segment is going.
Please. I would say that mTOR are always there, and we should pay equal respect to the mTOR inhibitors.
In which
line? PIK3 non-mutant, wild type, and also post PIK3 mutant failure can be used.
Yeah, that will always be there. The data is weakening because we have had a lot of side effects of toxicity, but other new drugs are coming in. Look at the AKT inhibitors, that data look very strong. PIK3 may go to third line, I don't know. But in a PIK3 mutated, I feel it will be second line, definitely, for always. Any one small comment before I stop, and I'll give it to Sachin. No. Okay, Sachin, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Savo. It was excellent and such a good discussion happened. And since yesterday we are having, the level of discussion has been too good actually. It's really heartening, and there's so much of learning over past 2 days. And thank you all the panelists and Dr. Saho for sparing your time. And please stay. There is another next session is also very exciting. And none other than Dr. Ashok Vaid is going to moderate this next session, which is on optimal sequencing of anti-HER2 therapies in HER2 positive. And we welcome Dr. Ashok Vaid, who's a well-known figure. He doesn't need any introduction. We started yesterday with him actually, the opening remarks. And we are ending with his session. So that's again a privilege to have him here again. And another 200 participants are listening to us. And so that speaks of the level of discussion we are having. And also we are having competing webinars here right now. So maybe the attendance is less than yesterday because there's a lot of competition and hematology sessions parallel going on. Dr. Nitesh could not join, I think, but he might join anytime once he's free from his other, he's in another webinar right now. But we have other panelists with us. Dr. Gaurav Gupta has joined or not? He's not there. So Dr. Gaurav and Dr. Nitesh could not join. Other panelists are there, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Sachin, for this opportunity, and good to be out there once again. And in the next 25 minutes, I will be taking you through the panel discussion on HER2 positive disease in the metastatic setting. And the entire discussion, let me share my screen. And now, can you see my slides? Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. So, excellent. So, now, second, what's happening? I can't move the. Okay. So, there we are. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, for this discussion on the optimal sequencing of anti-HER therapies in the HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer. And the panelists, Sachin, you said Gaurav and Nitesh have not been able to join.
And Dr. Sudhakar also is not there.
Okay, so we have Dr. Vivek Agarwala from Kolkata. We have Dr.
Sachin, you left out my name.
Dr. Nita is there, yeah. So this, I think this slide, sir, is.
This is as per what was sent over the mail across to me. If
Dr. Anita got her session changed, so we accommodated her in this session.
My apologies. And could carry on that. And then, in the interest of time, what we would do is the first half of the presentation is on a case we have treated over the last about 2 years, and the second half of the discussion will be more theoretical because some of these drugs are not still available in India, and Indian physicians are not using these drugs on a day-to-day basis. So our case for today's discussion is a 35-year-old premenopausal woman who did not have any family history. In 2018, she presented to us with this type of a picture. What you can see, a large mass in the breast and a lot of metastasis almost everywhere. And the biopsy was ER/PR low and HER2 positive, 3 positive, and it was a disseminated disease. So, and quite symptomatic actually for the lung mets, and which was surprising coming from an urban, well-educated family. She had a disease which is as bad as that, and I would skip some of the slides in the interest of time. So, my question in this disseminated setting is, what is the first treatment you guys would consider for this young woman, 34 years old, who's quite symptomatic for her disease in the lungs? And I think I need to take it up. And can I request Dr. Vivek Agarwala from Kolkata to offer his comments on this? and others can always sort of offer their comments through the discussions.
So if the liver function tests are fine, then I would be very happy to start a treatment with pertuzumab plus trastuzumab plus taxane. So paclitaxel is fine, I think. We can go ahead with.
So any other comments? Any other hello. Somebody has a mic which is reverberating. So. Other panelists, Dr. Nita, I could hear your voice. Yes.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for presenting the case. It's a young lady with a very aggressive disease. I agree with the other panelists. I would also like to do an evaluation of the cardiac evaluation, ECG, echo, along with the other parameters before we take them up. Okay, now one more quick question. Is the lung involved? Lung pulmonary mets is there?
Yes. So let me go to that slide and show you that. Yes.
Yeah.
Very symptomatic for lung mets, and thankfully her organ functions were good. Her liver function was good, heart function was good, and that is why the question about the first treatment. Okay, so there is some agreement about what should be done first: trastuzumab, and taxane.
Taxane. I also agree.
Any difference in the choice of taxanes between paclitaxel versus any other taxane or docetaxel in this setting?
So there is a phase 3 study which evaluated 3 types of taxanes. One is Pacli, the second is Dosi, third is nab-paclitaxel, and that showed a similar survival. So we can use either one of the 3. But the best evidence we have is the Cleopatra trial THP regimen. They showed a PFS of 1.5 years and overall survival of 4.5 years.
So
docetaxel was used.
Was that Dr. Manikandan?
Yes, sir.
Yes, spot on. I think, and that is the Cleopatra trial, the standard first line treatment for MBC when you are considering pertuzumab, trastuzumab, and docetaxel, and that's the study which versus placebo and trastuzumab and docetaxel, and one can see the quick separation of the curves. The curves are separated out, and it's an area intent to treat overall survival benefit in the arm which received dual anti-HER. So in today's time, dual anti-HER would be probably the best way to go about. We haven't heard any comment from Dr. Vikas and Dr. Rakesh. Any comments about that?
Sir, this is Rakesh Taran.
Yes, Rakesh.
What I would request is, as the disease burden is heavy, so I would like to go ahead with something like weekly taxanes, because considering the bulk of the disease, it's really tough to manage the narrow toxicity in such situation.
But remember, this is a 34-year-old lady, young, otherwise, with excellent organ functions, no compromise. Would you still want a weekly type of approach, and how do you integrate them with the weekly pertuzumab and trastuzumab? That would be everybody would like to.
Maybe pertuzumab and trastuzumab once in 3 weeks, and weekly paclitaxel for initial some weeks.
So how about Vikas? Would you adopt that approach?
Dr. Ashok, can I say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, one thing is that if Pacli is an option, then I think this patient also needs a central line. And whether we need denosumab for the skeletal lesion, that's just a thought process.
So she did have the bone-directed disease, but we are focusing majorly on the choice of the taxane and integration of the taxane with the rest of the drugs.
I think weekly will be a little difficult. I also find in an intense scenario, but yes, docetaxel 3 weekly is also a good option.
So can I make one comment, because this said Dr. Chaturvedi. So as already told by one of the panelists, that are comparing docetaxel, paclitaxel, and paclitaxel. But we have a more strong evidence for docetaxel, pertuzumab, and trastuzumab. So, different from the previous panelist, I would like to start her on docetaxel, pertuzumab, and trastuzumab, and later on I may switch on to some weekly therapy if the tolerance is poor.
But anticipating poor tolerance, I would not like to change the standard regimen.
Spot on. In a 34-year-old, one would not expect the tolerance is not going to be there. You're not talking of a 64 or a 74-year-old.
Exactly.
If he's young, a disease will be more aggressive. First hit should be the best hit.
So anybody would consider using any other drug like TDM1 or any other drug as a first-line treatment. And I have the Marian data out here, just for the sake of discussion, not that, this would be, and then where this is a comparison of Taxane, Herceptin versus TDM1. This was a negative trial, and the third arm was TDM1 plus pertuzumab. So this was a negative trial. Now she completed 6 cycles, and you can see the response out here. She did well. Good tolerance, no issues, and response in the primary, in the liver, stable skeletal lesion, was continued on bone-directed therapy and an improvement in the lung mets. So that was after 6 cycles, and she continued to have an ongoing response, and she was continued on trastuzumab and pertuzumab till about August of 2019, and at that point in time, there was some symptoms coming back, and as expected with this type of a burden of disease, there was a progression with now brain lesions. So that is where she failed within about a year or so, and there were multiple brain mets. What is the next treatment? Within 1 year, she's failed on docetaxel, pertuzumab, and trastuzumab. So
just to clear the point that once she completed her 6 cycles of treatment, because she was low ER/PR positive, so was she put on hormonal treatment also along with?
My apologies. I should have brought it up. I think the focus was on HER2 so much that the slides missed that out. She was put on tamoxifen along with that. I can't recall now, but she was on the hormonal drugs.
So now, sir, because she has brain metastasis, I think you have correctly pointed out that she received radiotherapy.
Yeah, both supra as well as infratentorial with lesional edema. There was no choice for a limited radiation to be given.
And so she is a perfect candidate for starting TDM1 now.
Okay, that is Vivek, yes, and anybody else has a different opinion about that?
I'm little keen in starting her with lapatinib. Okay, anyhow, the other drugs gets discontinued, both pertuzumab, trastuzumab. I would be keen in giving her lapatinib. Also, not only in the brain, she has progressed in other sites also.
Right.
Lapatinib capecitabine will be an option to because she has received 1 year of chemotherapy and oral drugs, whole brain RT.
So, but now considering that the blood-brain barrier is already breached, is there an advantage of one over the other? And then what does the data say?
So can I make some comments? So because now the answer is straightforward, TDM1, as of majority of the panelists are answering. But we have certain options like TDM1. So already we have Emily and Trisha trial which have shown that the superiority of TDM1 over lapatinib and capecitabine. So with 30 months of OS, 30 months of OS and almost 5 months improvement in OS, I would be happy to start on TDM1. But before if
can everybody see the slide? Is this slide visible to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the Emilia and the Teresa data. Yes.
But other options are also there, which are obviously not available in India, like tucatinib. So if we
coming to that, I'm coming to that next. So let's just stay.
Just a small comment because she has a CNS progression. So I think lapatinib capecitabine combination with 65% intracranial responses, as shown in landscape trial, they are also a good competitor for TDM1.
So the house is divided, and it's a fair choice. It's a fair choice. LabCape versus TDM1. If you base it on the Emilia, and then if you look at in the context of the whole setting, lab kit would be one of the options. And then Teresa, we know that this is a much later line. The other, the arm was the physician's choice treatment versus TDM1. This was a later line. Now, this lady, we put her on TDM1, and then in the we know that. The CNS disease it behaves bad, and we know that the risk of CNS disease is based on certain parameters, certain factors, and the choices. As there was just a comment about the other drugs, we would be coming in the subsequent slides about neratinib and some of the other drugs. So these are the options which have been opened up, and. Anybody would like to comment on that? Progression-free survival and overall survival by CNS metastasis in HER2 positive disease. This is one of the points which is a point of discussion in the clinic. Your and my patients obviously come back and ask us, Doc, now the disease has gone into brain within 1 year, and what's the outlook? Who would like to take it up? How do you counsel your patient and the families in the clinic based on the CNS disease in such a quick period of time?
If you see the progression-free survival as shown by your graph out here, the CNS METs at diagnosis and after diagnosis, almost the two lines are falling with each other. The progression-free survival, I think it's almost the same.
Absolutely. I think this disease behaves bad, and there isn't much to choose between the two of them. Whether you have it up front or you have it, but of course, a lot of things would depend upon how much is the systemic disease, how much is the intracranial disease. This would be like talking about the entire bucket as a whole, and the overall survival, of course, would depend upon the response and the ability to take treatments and what type of treatment is available to an individual. Any other thoughts or comments about these two curves out there? Gaurav is not there. Dr. Sudhakar, any comments from your side?
See, initially the two curves are separating for the overall survival. So those with the metastasis coming after the diagnosis. So you have a little better improvement in overall survival till your CNS disease comes. But ultimately, the OS meets at a point, the two curves again merge together. So there may be a little better overall survival if you get the METs a little later down in the line of the disease.
There is a very clear cut difference in overall survival once you have the CNS METs. Right. So that is what it says.
So it's a rapidly downhill course. Now we'll move on. And she was doing well, and by the early part of this year, she had a progression again. And then now what next? What happens to this? So this kidney has received THP and TDM1. What next?
So I think can I make comment?
Yes, please go ahead.
Since she has already
on the lighter side of it, the fastest fingers first. Whoever.
So now we have two choices mainly. So considering the present scenario and availability in India, I think Lapatinib Capecitabine would be the most reasonable option. But if we talk of the newer drugs, so I think she is a good candidate for Trastuzumab deruxtecan as per Destiny trial, which has already shown a PFS, significant improvement in PFS of 16 months. But she has got the lung. FDA approved. But in this, particularly considering in this case, she has got a progression in lungs. And this drug has got almost an IND rate of 13%, if I remember it correctly. So I would be slightly reluctant in that point has to be taken into account that if she develops some IND sort of thing, then we would be in difficult situation. So Lapatinib Capecitabine is a very good.
Only the grade 1 and 2 can go back. 3 and 4 just cannot. Depending upon the 4 is of course cannot. 3 depending upon the reversal, and anything which goes beyond about 4 to 6 weeks, you just cannot go back on this drug. So these are theoretically the other options which are available. And anybody would like to offer comments?
Yeah. So I was just
I was just wondering that whether anybody would like to use a double HER2 blockade with combining lapatinib with trastuzumab now in this case when you wanting, or you want to just use KPLAB only.
So let me come to the next slide. That's an interesting point, and then we'll come back and revisit this point. So we recently assessed her, and now she's again progressed in the brain. And this is within a short period. This is hardly about 4.5, 5 months, 4 months that she's progressed in brain. It's very recent. I couldn't get those pictures, but this is a recent assessment done about a week back. And what is the role of neratinib and tucatinib? These are two new drugs which are CNS active. And who would like to take up? I have these slides, and somebody could elaborate on these slides about the neratinib capecitabine and lapatinib capecitabine versus capecitabine, the NALA trial, and the other trials on that. Anybody can comment on those these two and these two options. Sachin, at the same time, I have to ask you how much time we are still left with.
Sir, about 3-4 minutes, sir.
Oh, quick.
So I think this lady has a CNS progression, and if we consider NALA trial, so they have considered patients with stable brain mets. While if we consider HER2 clamp study, so tucatinib was mainly used in the patients who progressed in brain.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that very, very pivotal point that the NALA trial had stable meds, and then I'm coming to tucatinib. So please continue on your comments, because we have
68% intracranial rates of tucatinib, which would I think force me to use tucatinib, and 14 months of PFS benefit is absolutely
and very active in combination with all the other partners. That's good about this drug.
Cytopine, everything. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think the tucatinib trial was present in the virtual ASCO.
Okay. So these are some of the SABC abstracts. Tucatinib, trastuzumab, capecitabine. You can see a triple drug combination versus a 2-drug combination, and one can see the primary endpoint of the progression-free survival. One can see the separation of the curves quick, and in the drug combination versus the 2-drug combination, and one can see a benefit in terms of the tucatinib. However, and progression-free survival subset analysis was across the board for almost everyone, accrued benefit out of that. Of course, being a small molecule, we are still beset with diarrhea, fatigue, and all those issues. One will have to learn to use these. And the overall survival, again, imagine in this group of patients who have been heavily pretreated and who have received pertuzumab, trastuzumab, TDM1, and then with brain mets, one still gets an overall survival benefit in the total population. Which is
there is a question from one of our faculty. Do we need to re-biopsy to check receptor status at any point of time here?
So who would take that up? Anybody wants to take it up?
At this point, already had other, not only CNS disease, had other disease. Yes, I would change of drugs. Yes, I will do at least in 1 year or 2 years the patient-dependent biopsy from an accessible site.
How often do you find the negativity of trastuzumab when patients shedding their AGR2 positive status?
10-15% should be, sir.
So,
because receptor status do change.
The overall survival benefit in the HER2 climb and then CNS progression-free survival. Now, this is something important. Anybody wants to take it up with brain mets, intracranial activity on tucatinib, which is the subject of this discussion. Somebody had made a mention about using tucatinib or one of these drugs. Would you please take it up once again?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this is the HER2 climb on the virtual ASCO this year. Tremendous response. 68% reduction in the CNS progression or death was seen, and you see the curve separating, leaving a 50%.
Nobody living beyond a year, and then look at the median progression-free survival, and then the number of patients living long enough on this study.
Correct.
So tucatinib has been approved. Can't go into those details. Is a recent approval, in fact, by the US FDA. Now, the newest kid on the block did briefly talk about the role of trastuzumab DXd in later lines. Again, this is a drug antibody conjugate or the ADC, whichever way you call it. The data again is coming out as robust, and again the drug is just about 6 months out of approval by the US FDA. And these are the patients who have received more than 2 lines of HER2 directed therapy. So what are the implications for practice out of all these?
Sir, please conclude now.
Yes.
So you can yourself,
Yeah, now the new thing is, we were just talking about abemaciclib. There is a data about abemaciclib, her HER trial, where they are using so the new thing is the endocrine therapy and HER2 directed therapy as well. So that's the last slide. The take home message is that the algorithm in today's time is well defined. There will be small nuances about choice of the taxane, but the anti-HER is well defined. But this segment is also getting crowded. There will be more choices, and patients can realize an extension of survival, particularly in the poor prognostic group of CNS metastasis, as we have seen with the data of tucatinib. And soon we will see the pathway getting more complicated, as there are no defined subgroups on the basis of specific biomarkers in the HER2 disease. I think that is all for this panel discussion. Any pertinent comment, 5 seconds by any one of the panelists, and Sachin, then over to you, back to you. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to be a part of the proceedings this evening. Back to the panelists.
Yeah, that was really excellent, sir.
Thank you so much.
But it is very costly.
No, leave the cost aside. We are discussing size.
So things will become cheaper in